everyone to part 6 of our Brick Breaker tutorial. This is Mike Page with Scripting is Fun. In this tutorial we're going to be adding in a power-up. We're going to do an extra life power-up. So when the ball hits a brick, there will be a random % chance that a power-up is dropped, and if we catch that power-up on our panel, we'll then apply its effects. So the first step we need to do here is actually get a power-up sprite out here and get it all set up so that we have something that we can instantiate. So I'm going to go to my Sprites folder here, and I have brought in a sprite sheet with just some basic shapes on it. And we call this a sprite sheet because there's more than one sprite here. So what I need to do first is actually get Unity to break up these 5 different shapes here into 5 different pieces, because right now it thinks it's all one piece. So we're going to select this in our project panel, and then over in the inspector we'll make sure it's marked texture type as sprite. Sprite mode, if single means it's just one sprite on the file, there's actually multiple here, so I'm going to change that to multiple. I'm going to go down and hit apply to apply that change, and then I'm going to click right here where it says sprite editor to open up my sprite editor. Now I can see a blown up version of the sprite sheet which has these different shapes, and I want to slice these up into individual sprites. So I'm going to use the slice tool right here, and I'm just going to stick with automatic. I don't need a high amount of precision here. We're just going to slice these shapes out. So I'm just going to hit the slice button here, and then you'll notice that each of these shapes has a bounding box around it now. So sprites always live in some sort of a rectangle or a square. So it will look for visible pixels and it'll make the shape based off of where those are. So now I have these shapes all individually selected. I'm going to hit the apply button here at the top to go ahead and apply that change, and then when I can close my sprite editor, and over here in my project panel now I've got a little arrow I can click which will open this up, and it shows me all these different shapes have been sliced into their own pictures here. Okay, so I'm going to grab this green circle here, and I'm going to drag this green circle sprite out into my scene, and I'm going to use this to make a extra life power up here. So it's a little bit big, so one thing you can do with your sprites is you can click on your sprite sheet, and over here in its import settings we can tell it how many pixels should match 1 unit of space. So right now 100 pixels goes across 1 unit. So let's actually make this number a little bigger. The more pixels we pack in a unit, the smaller the object gets. So let's bring this down by maybe about half. So let's double the pixels per unit to 200. Hit apply, and you notice how that dropped that down to a smaller shape. I think I want it even smaller. Let's try 250 and apply. There we go. Let's try that. Now you could also go in here and you could scale it. But if I apply this change to the sprite sheet, then all the sprites will scale themselves down by the same amount. And if I decide to use more of these shapes here, then they'll all kind of stay relative size to each other by changing their import settings down here in the sprite sheet itself. So I set pixels per unit to 250 here. That gets me a decent sized shape still, and you're just going to imagine that this shape will move down the screen after it's made, and we want to be able to catch it. Alright, and it's not bigger than the brick that it's coming out of, so that makes a little bit more sense. Let's give this a name. This is going to be my extra life power up. And then I need to make this into a prefab because I want to spawn some of these in. Alright, before we do that though, let's add a few more things. This power up is going to need a script, so that it knows that when it's created it needs to move down the screen. It's also going to need a collider so that it can collide with the paddle down here. So let's add a few components to this guy. So first of all, let's go ahead and add a 2D collider. It's a circle, so a circle collider makes sense. If I zoom in here, we can see that the circle collider is now right there, so I'm just going to bring it down around my shape there. And so I've got my circle collider on there. Now we've been using so far just collisions with a collider that doesn't allow things to pass through it. In this case I want to make this object so that other objects can pass through it. So I'm going to mark this as a trigger collider. So I'm going to mark is trigger. A trigger collider will not block other colliders from moving through it, but it will trigger an event anytime that something touches it. And we'll use that when we get to where we want the paddle to be able to catch it. We'll be looking for a trigger event to happen. So we'll just mark that as trigger for right now. We're also going to need to make sure that one of the objects we want to have collide has a rigid body. So the player, or the paddle here, does not have a rigid body, and the Extra Life PowerUp does not have a rigid body yet. So one of these two objects has to have a rigid body. Let's go ahead and add that to our paddle. So I'm going to add component, physics 2D, rigid body 2D. Remember, we got to take gravity scale to 0, and right now this paddle is colliding. We don't really want it to react to those collisions. So what we can do here is we can turn some constraints on. We can just tell it to freeze the position on the X and the Y. Alright, so we've got a rigid body and one of the two objects we want to have the collision. We've got our Extra Life PowerUp with a collider that has been marked as a trigger. So he is ready to go. We also need to add a script. So let's make a brand new script in our script folder here. And we will call this our PowerUp script. Okay, let's take our PowerUp script here and just drag and drop it out here on our PowerUp. So now it has a PowerUp script. Alright, so we've got the PowerUp script attached, we've got the circle collider. For right now, that's everything we need this PowerUp to have. So we will now go ahead and make this into a prefab. To make things into a prefab, I'm going to select my prefab folder here, and I'm just going to grab it from the hierarchy and drag and drop it into my prefab folder. And now I have an Extra Life PowerUp object saved here as a prefab. Again, they always turn blue when they're prefabs. And then we'll just leave it out in the scene for now so we can start seeing how it moves when we start adding to the script. So next step here is let's get the PowerUp moving down the screen. So we're going to go to that PowerUp script that we just made. In the PowerUp script, we just want this PowerUp to move straight down the screen after it's created. So we are going to need a speed variable up here so we can control how fast it moves. So let's make a float called speed. And let's make that a public float so we can actually set it out in the inspector. And in the update function, we just want this object to move straight down the screen. So we're not moving it with the physics system this time. We're actually going to move this with the transform.Translate command, which just moves the position of the transform over time. So we're going to say transform.Translate. And then we have to give it a vector to move along. So we want it to move straight down the screen. So we want to make a new vector. And we can use a vector 2 here since we're in a 2D game. And we want it to move 0 on the X, but we want it to move down on the Y. So I'm going to give it a -1 on the Y. Y direction down the screen, that's a negative direction of movement. So I have to give it a -1 there. Okay. Now, we also want to make sure that we're moving this on a time-based movement system instead of frame-based. So we're going to take this times time.delta time. That splits that movement up over a second's worth of time instead of every frame. And then we're going to take that times our speed so that we can control how fast it moves down the screen. So this will now move straight down the screen. Let's go ahead and test this out as we go. So now if we hit play, we see our PowerUp moves. Now a 10 is pretty fast. So let's make that PowerUp move a little slower. Let's maybe put it at a 5 and see what that looks like. We're just testing to see if we have enough time to get underneath it. That still seems a little fast. Maybe we'll just give it a 3. And we're just getting an initial speed kind of set here. There we go. I think I like that better. It still moves pretty quick, but it gives us an opportunity at least to try to catch it. So we've got the PowerUp moving straight down the screen. The next thing we want to do is when this PowerUp touches the paddle, we want the paddle to know that that has happened and to apply the effect of the PowerUp. So we need to do an onTriggerEnter2D function on one of these two objects. We did place a trigger collider on the circle. So to detect when that hits something, it's on trigger enter 2D. Let's go into our paddle script here, because it's the paddle that really cares about the collision. So let's add to our paddle our void on trigger enter 2D function. And then we want to be able to capture information about the collider that hit us. So let's make a collider 2D variable called other. And then whenever the paddle touches something, when its collider touches a trigger collider, this will run automatically and will capture that other object here. Right, it'll get stored, its collider. So now that we're here, let's just see if this is working by putting a debug.log statement in here. We're going to say hit, and then let's just have it tell us what the name of the other object is, so other.name, and there we go. So now it'll tell us whatever it is that we hit here, and it should only work when we hit a trigger collider. So let's save that, and let's just see what happens out here. Let's hit play, and now when it hit us, did you see how it said down here, hit extra life power up? So when the power up hit us, it triggered that event to happen. Alright, so that's actually showing that our collisions are working. So instead of it actually just triggering the event, what we want to do is we want to apply the effect of the power up. So in this case, we want it just to add an extra life. So we're going to go here and we can get rid of this debug, and we can just actually have it go out to our game manager. So here's our game manager, and we can actually send it to this public function update lives, and we can send it a positive number of lives, like a number 1, and it will add that to our lives and it will update everything. So let's go back to our paddle script here, and let's just have it go to the game manager, and then we'll say update lives. We will send it a 1, and that will cause this to update our lives whenever the power up hits us. We also then want to get rid of that power up, because once we hit it we want it to disappear. So we will go to use our destroy command here, and what we want it to do is destroy the power up. The power up is the other game object in the collision. So I'm going to feed in other.gameObject, and now when it hits us, it will update our lives and it will destroy that power up, so it will disappear from the screen. So let's go check and see what works here. So when it hits us now, did you see how our lives went to 2 and the power up disappeared and it went out of the game? So that the function of it now is working. Let's add in a little code here to make sure that this is actually the extra life power up that we just hit. There's a few ways we could do this. For now, let's actually just use the tag system inside of Unity here. So let's give extra life power up here a tag. So let's go here, let's add a tag, let's call this extra life, and we'll save that. And then let's go to our extra life power up here and let's tag this as extra life. This way, if we add more power-ups in the future, or we have other objects in here that might have trigger colliders on it, it won't just assume that it's an extra life. So now in our script here, before we go ahead and add a life, let's do a check here to see if the thing that we hit, so if other.compare tag, and then we just made that tag extra life. So let's just do this like this for now. So in the trigger collision, if the thing that we just collided with, this other, if its tag is extra life, that's the tag I just made and assigned to it, then we know it's an extra life power up. We'll tell the game manager to update our lives, and then we'll go ahead and destroy that power up. Okay? This way we're just kind of future-proofing ourselves here for what we might want to do in the project later on. So let's just make sure that it still disappears when we get underneath it. So here we go. Yep, and it still worked. It still triggered the event. We still got our extra life, and it disappeared from the system here. Alright, so we made a bunch of changes to our extra life power-up that's out here in the scene, but we haven't made those changes to the prefab. So if you notice, this is the one in the scene. It's got our PowerUp script. It's got a speed of 3. If we go look here, though, our prefab has not got that change yet. It doesn't have that speed of 3. If I go back here to the scene, you'll notice that speed here is bolded and the 3 is there. So when you're working on one of these in the scene, it's going to tell you what has changed, what's different than the prefab by bolding it. Once we get this where we want it and we want to apply these changes back to the prefab, all we have to do is go to the supply button up here in the top right corner of the inspector and click it. You'll notice now that speed went back to regular text, and what has happened is I've told the prefab to match whatever had changed here. So if I go down to my prefab extra life, you'll notice now it did get the speed, and so everything is now set exactly the same in the prefab as the one I had out in the scene. So that's pretty handy when you're trying to set these up and make changes in the scene to get it working the way you want. Now that I have that done, I'm going to go ahead and delete this guy from the scene. And the next step here to making the PowerUp work is when a brick is hit by the ball, we want to know if a PowerUp should be dropped or not. And we want it to have a random chance of dropping. So let's go into our script here and let's look at the ball script, because the ball script is what's paying attention to collisions with things. And right here it already knows that it was the brick that it collided with. So we're going to add a little bit more here to this section. Not only do we want the explosion and to add our score and to destroy this brick, but we also want to see if we should make a PowerUp. So let's just do that up at the top here. So if it was a brick, let's generate a random number and use that to see if we should drop a PowerUp. So let's just make a temporary, let's just make an integer here, and we will call this random chance, and we'll set that equal to our random.range command, and let's give it a minimum. So let's say it's let's generate a number between 1 and 100. Now when you're working with integers, you'll notice that the minimum is inclusive and the maximum is exclusive. That means that it will never pick the maximum number. So if I actually wanted to go all the way up to 100, I'd have to say 101. So we'll do that. So that picks a number between 1 and 100. Alright, and we're going to do 1 to 100 because that way we can kind of make it a percentage chance. It might make more sense in the math for you. So now that we've done that, we're going to do a check here. We're going to say if rand chance, and this just asks if it's greater than 50. Alright, so if rand chance, if the number it picked is bigger than a 50, sorry, let's do less than. That makes more sense. If it's less than 50, then we want to drop a PowerUp. And of course, if we have the numbers between 1 and 100, and we're asking for all the numbers that are less than 50, we're asking for roughly 50% chance here that we'll get a PowerUp. And then what we're going to do here is then we need to instantiate one of those PowerUps into the scene. Before we can do that, we actually have to have a reference to that PowerUp through a variable. So let's add a variable to the top of the script here. Let's make a public transform. Let's call this our PowerUp. And then we will save that. We'll go out into Unity here and let's go ahead and assign that in. So let's go to my ball, because we were working in the ball script, and let's give it the PowerUp right down here. So I'm going to grab an extra life PowerUp and drop it right in. So now it has a link to the PowerUp that we want it to create. Back in our script then, we can go down here to where if we're going to drop the PowerUp, we can use the instantiate command, and we can give it the PowerUp prefab variable we just made, and then we want this to actually be created right where the brick is before we destroy the brick here. So we're going to feed in other, because other is the brick, and then we're going to say .transform dot position. So we're going to give it the bricks position, and we can also give it the bricks rotation. So we can say other dot transform dot rotation, and that will cause that power-up to be created right there where the brick is. And then of course once the power-up is created, its script will kick in and it'll start moving down the screen. So let's just see if this is working as we would expect. I should get a power-up about half the time here, the way this is set up. So let's hit play. Alright, let's see if I can get a power-up. Okay, none that time. I did get one that time, and I did get an extra life. So if I get this, get the ball bouncing around here a little bit. I'm getting power-ups dropping down. Now you notice that I missed that last power-up. You see how it's still here? It's going to be dropping forever down the screen. So we're going to want to actually make sure that we get rid of these if they fall off the bottom of the screen. So if we don't catch them, let's just have them go away. So to make the power-ups remove themselves when they get off the bottom of the screen, let's just check for a coordinate on the Y at which they're no longer visible. So let's just do an if here. We can say if transform dot position dot Y. So if our Y coordinate, if that gets a less than whatever the bottom of the screen is, then we want to remove it. So let's go look and see where that is. We're going to get that coordinate. So let's drag a power up in here. Let's drag it down. So when it gets down here off the bottom of the screen somewhere, its Y is at about a -5. So maybe we'll go as far as a -6. We'll make sure it gets down off the bottom here a ways. So let's go back in. I can remove this. Alright, so back in our script, let's just say a -6. That's a float, so if our Y gets lower than a -6, let's just destroy it. So destroy, and if I want to destroy the game object that the script is attached to, I just put in game object in here, and then it'll know, okay, destroy this game object that the script is attached to. So now we'll get rid of those when they hit the bottom of the screen. We don't have to worry about that. Let's go ahead and test it out and see if it works the way we want it to. So let's get a power up to spawn, and let's just let it fall off the bottom of the screen. And there you go. You notice it disappeared when it got down here off the bottom of the screen, and that was good. That gets our power up spawning into the scene, dropping and applying its effect. We could add all sorts of other power-ups in here. We can also do like a power down, like a negative power-up, which might slow down our paddle or somehow make the game a little tougher. So not only do you want to catch the good power-ups, but you want to avoid the bad ones. And that's just a matter of making more of those and just setting up what happens when they collide. So I think this is probably a good spot to end this video here on how to add a power-up to our game. You can get all creative with this and make power-ups do whatever you want them to do. If you come up with a cool idea, make sure you let me know about it. Thanks for watching as always, and we will see you next time.